I am Nick Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me today is one of City and State's columnists and political consultant for Manette, Phelps, and Phillips.
Yep.
Bruce Gyory, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. And thanks for remembering the name of my new firm. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. So I wanted to talk to you about your column in our previous issue
Yes.
of City and State. You looked at how de Blasio can find success and kind of find his footing as a mayor in kind of his messaging, it seemed like,
Yes.
what you were trying to touch on.
Actually, it goes back to the City and State issue of the 10 greatest mayors of New York City, and I was honored that you guys asked me to be one of the judges, especially given how prestigious the other 9 judges were, or however many there were. But all kidding aside, it distilled down to 3 things that were a common denominator for mayoral success. One is mayors who picked both an important mission and then succeeded at it. And 3 examples come to mind of recent mayors. Ed Koch was to restore the fiscal balance after the fiscal crisis and hence New York's independence. Giuliani's mission was to crack the back of crime and to prove New York was governable again. And Bloomberg's mission was, in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11, to have the city recover both its economic spirit, but also its kind of spirit, the spirit of being New York. All 3 succeeded. A mayor who failed at that was John Lindsay, who picked the theme of almost urban rebirth, but the problem was there were so many national challenges to urban life that Lindsay couldn't possibly succeed at that. But because he picked a mission that didn't work, he bit off more than he could chew. And my worry about Mayor de Blasio is not that his theme of inequality is not correct. It is irrebuttable that that with this degree of inequality, it is harmful to the city, and we would be better off with a middle class that was growing and stable. But can any mayor himself, and someday herself, achieve that on their own, or should they be in the bully pulpit and defining an achievable subset of that? For instance, a mayor can make a great difference in excellence in education. A mayor can develop, as Ed Koch proved, an affordable housing program. That was a question, and I just worry. I'm not refuting or trying to say Mayor de Blasio is wrong on the inequality theme. I just hope he picks an achievable mission. The second theme is mayors are intrinsically administrators. Governors and presidents are functionally policy developers. They fund policy initiatives. They get them through the Congress or not, or get them through the state legislature, get them funded. But mayors are responsible for picking up the garbage, clearing snow. And Mayor LaGuardia had it right. There's no Republican or Democratic way to clean the streets. And what mayors should realize is that their reputation for being top-flight administrators and getting that right enhances their political capital. Or in the reverse, if they're perceived as not administering their city well, they have a problem. So you have to really keep an eye on that. And the third thing is that because so much of New York City's budget is a function of federal aid, but now particularly what comes from Albany, they have to be very good lobbyists, in effect. And one of the things, particularly with Albany, they have to be able to do is to be able to build cross-regional alliances, because if you just go up to Albany and say, I'm the mayor of New York, here I am, here's my program, it doesn't work. And why? It's the politics. 70% of the vote in the last gubernatorial election came from outside of New York City. New York, despite being 42% of the state's population and 40% of registered voters, has not cast over 30% in a gubernatorial election since 1982, when it hit the grand sum of 31%. So among the things Mayor de Blasio could attempt to do is, let's start getting New York City to vote its weight. That would make a huge difference. Let's say in this year's gubernatorial election, instead of casting 30%, New York cast 35%, and upstate share came down from 46 to 41. That moved towards parity. That would give, remember from the Metternich era, the old line, the greatest diplomacy is backed by the largest armies? Well, those vote totals are the armies of politics. So I think those are the 3 challenges: a definable mission, developing a reputation for being a sound crackerjack administrator, which would build political capital, and then 3, how adept is he at getting things out of Albany and New York? And that is not just this mayor, that is any mayor.
Interesting. And I wanted to touch on a point that you just made about the voter, the disparity in how in voter turnout. De Blasio has touted his mandate that he won as kind of the impetus for his progressive agenda, that showing that there's huge populist support. But when you look at the numbers and you look at the fact that even though he had 75% of the electorate, it was still less. He had less people vote for him in New York City than Governor Cuomo, I believe, voted for him in the entire city as well. So how do you?
Although I give him a bit of a pass on that, simply because the polls showed that was a runaway, and a lot of times when you have a runaway, you don't get the higher vote turnout. When you got the higher vote turnouts was like the Giuliani-Dinkins contest, both of which were close elections. Turnout was 1.8 and 1.9 million rather than in the 1.1 million, which it was this last time, and I think the time before. So, but for Mayor de Blasio, if he was a factor with his political allies in building up New York City's share in the gubernatorial vote, people in Albany would pay attention.
Interesting. Now, I want to talk a little bit about his messaging as well, because he's had a couple of, I wouldn't say controversies, but
bad weeks,
little kind of mini bumps in the road, especially in dealing with the media. As a strategist, as a political consultant, I mean, are these just kind of typical growing pains for a mayor trying to find his footing in delivering a message, or is this indicative of a larger problem in his press strategy?
Can I sound mealy-mouthed and say it's both?
Okay.
But here's what I really think it is. This is a little bit like a baseball game, an old-fashioned baseball game, when you violate the rules of the game and you get caught on it. Here's the mistake the mayor, I think, has made. Remember when he went to AIPAC and didn't bring the press in, and he said, this will never happen again? Well, last week he went to Rebney and didn't bring the press, and he had a meeting with Valerie Jarrett, top aide to the President of the United States, that he didn't immediately bring people into. You reporters had to track him down. Then remember that story that the Times did on Doherty when the East Side had the problems with the snow, and the Times had the story, and it looked like the mayor and the mayor's people were kind of making Doherty the fall guy, and people had they thought it was an ungentlemanly way to treat a public servant who was trying his best, even if it didn't work out if you lived on the Upper East Side. And the next day the mayor said the Times had the story wrong. Well, the Times didn't feel it had the story wrong. So surprise, surprise, one of the deans of the New York Press Corps, Marcia Kramer, a tough, good, aggressive reporter in whose DNA has the journalistic heartbeat of New York going back to the Kempton and Breslin days, she calls him on it on that. So they're calling him. So this is a little bit like a baseball game where, if you violated the rules of the game against Earl Weaver's Orioles, the next time you came up to bat, you'd get a dust down pitch and get knocked on the ground. I think that's what the mayor is getting. The solution to that is for the mayor and his press people to realize the press has a job to cover him. He has a job. It would behoove him to let the press cover him and work that out behind the scenes, and then you'll see some of these kinds of stories perhaps not be handled. But on the other hand, he did, and he made another rookie mistake on that Findlater. That was not a call that most seasoned mayors would have had either a deputy mayor make the call or have someone else call and inquire, and not elevate it to a mayoral call. Now, in fairness to de Blasio, he was a councilman and a public advocate. Their job is to make those kind of calls. One of the things when you jump up to being a mayor of New York or a governor of New York or a president of the United States, it takes a while before you internalize that absolutely everything you say and everything you do is put under a nuclear microscope. I think he'll learn. I think so the reason I said both when I made my mealy-mouthed response was I don't think this does irreparable harm to him, provided he kind of gets it right and is not perceived by the media as putting impediments in your ability to cover him. That's what I really think was going on.
Now, if he doesn't get his universal pre-K proposal passed, or he doesn't, his affordable housing plan is not met with the same, enthusiasm as some of his other policy ideas, then you could probably say that, maybe he's gotten off on the wrong foot, I would imagine, right?
Here's where I'd like to cut him some slack. In 1950, keeping with, you can tell on a cold winter day I'm yearning for baseball in spring. But when Mickey Mantle came up in 1951, he had to go back to Joplin to learn how to hit the curveball. When Willie Mays came up midseason in that same year of 51, I think he went 1 for 23, right? They became pretty good baseball players. Now, if the mayor has a rough session in Albany, let's see what he does. Let's give him the ability, and transitions are tough. I mean, anybody who's been through a transition to run a major office like mayor, it's a daunting task. So let's see if he does that. I still think a pre-K victory can be declared on pre-K if it's a statewide program that is dependably funded. It doesn't mean you have to have all of your elements. But I would argue the longer he fights that, he could turn what should be a victory into the perception of a defeat. And I still say there's a larger issue in school aid, which is not just these 50,000 or 73,000 slots for pre-K, as important as they are, but what about the proper funding for the 1.1 million school children in K through 12? Right. And that's one where perhaps the mayor could enter in, build alliances with upstate school districts, many of whom have the same interests as New York City, because so many of those upstate school districts are either poor urban districts or high-tax, low-wealth rural districts, so that the mayor has an opportunity. That's something Bloomberg never did, and Giuliani never did. Perhaps as this administration goes on, Mayor de Blasio could build those alliances and present Albany with a much wider array of support for basic school funding.
Interesting. So I'm assuming then you think that rather than what the mayor has done, which is kind of mobilize and galvanize his support for universal pre-K in New York City with people who are probably going to hop on board with that anyway with a new mayor, you're saying he would get more attention from the governor, from the legislature, if he kind of built a coalition statewide.
Both for pre-K and the other. I mean, look at what he's functionally been asking the state legislature to do. Pre-K is enormously popular. All the polling data says that people want pre-K everywhere. So you go to Albany and you basically ask not just Republicans, but your fellow Democrats from the suburbs and upstate, oh, give me a pre-K program, but don't get one for yourself. Now, that doesn't mean he couldn't have gone up there and said, hey, this is going to be very expensive. We're willing to tax ourselves to do this, so let's make this tax a part of a statewide program. But he never put the basic proposition forward that he was going to support a statewide pre-K so that he could bring in upstate and suburban legislators. He saw it through the prism, we want to tax ourselves, this is like safe city, safe streets, but this was something where the rest of the state felt they had an incentive too, because they wanted to bring pre-K home, especially in an election year.
Interesting. And you've seen, actually, I recall a couple of weeks ago, there were some school districts upstate that issued press releases saying, oh, well, New York City already gets such a large share of education funding. Why should they get, even an extra amount even for a dedicated tax?
But I'll give you another thing. The foundation aid formula, which is the mechanism to redress the CFE case, which found that basic school aid was unconstitutional. Foundation aid, in dollar terms, benefits the city of New York most because of 1.1 million students. But when you look on a district-per-district basis, upstate school districts benefit on a percentage more because they have that combination of high tax, low wealth, and poor urban areas. It's made for a coalition. that was the biggest mistake I think Bloomberg made in trying to be an education mayor, that he never built that coalition. And being elected as a Republican, because a lot of these districts upstate are represented by Republicans in the Senate, he could have made that. Well, maybe this is kind of de Blasio's opportunity in the second and third year of his mayoralty to build that broader coalition. And I repeat, people say to me a lot of times when I give talks on the politics of New York that, especially when I'm in a New York City audience, well, why the State of the State messages always focus on upstate, and why at the end of the budget does Long Island school aid always seem to get taken care of? And I said, simple reason. 70% of the vote in the gubernatorial election comes from outside New York City. In democracies, funding formulas tend to follow election returns. But New York City has the capacity, with 42% of the population, I repeat, and 40% of registered voters, that if it starts no longer undervoting but voting its weight, it will get listened to in Albany. Building alliances and building up the city's vote could be the solutions to the current obstacles Mayor de Blasio faces.
A very reasoned argument. Bruce Gyory, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.